The Volanthi starship descended through Earth's atmosphere on a cold morning in October, its silver hull catching the sunlight as it broke through the clouds above Colorado Princess Kalira. Version pressed her face against the observation window, watching the strange blue planet grow larger beneath her. And she felt nothing but mild curiosity about these primitive creatures. Called human, she was the third daughter of Emperor Version the Mighty, ruler of 17 star systems and commander of the greatest fleet in the known galaxy. And at the age of what humans would call 19, she had already grown bored with diplomatic missions to lesser species. Her father had sent her to Earth as part of the First Contact delegation, a gesture of goodwill toward the newest members of the galactic community. And Kalira considered it a waste of her time. The humans had only discovered faster-than-light travel 5 years ago, and their technology was laughably primitive compared to the Volanthi, who had ruled the stars for 10,000 years. Kalira stood, nearly 7 feet tall, with pale blue skin and 4 arms that moved with fluid grace, and her eyes were large and golden, capable of seeing in spectrums that humans could not even imagine. She wore the ceremonial robes of her station, deep purple fabric threaded with silver, and a circlet of living crystal rested upon her brow. The delegation landed at a research facility nestled in the mountains, where human scientists had been working on new propulsion systems. And Kalira followed her guards through sterile white corridors, while human officials stammered greetings and bowed awkwardly. She barely listened to their words, thinking, instead of the hunting grounds on her homeworld and the great beasts she would pursue when this tedious mission ended. The tour of the facility lasted hours, and Kalira's attention wandered as scientists explained their work in terms so basic that she felt insulted on behalf of her tutors. Then, the alarms began to scream. Red lights flashed throughout the corridor, and a computerized voice announced a containment breach in the atmospheric processing wing, warning that toxic compounds were spreading through the ventilation system. Kalira's guards immediately surrounded her, but in the chaos of running humans and flickering lights, she became separated from them when a blast door sealed between her and her escorts. She found herself alone in a corridor filled with yellow-green gas that smelled of burning metal, and she could hear screaming in the distance as humans fled or collapsed. The gas did not bother Kalira, for her species could breathe compounds that would kill most organic life. But she knew that humans were fragile creatures who needed very specific atmospheric conditions to survive. She turned to find an exit, and that was when she saw the boy. He was small and thin, perhaps 12 years old by human standards, with messy brown hair and wide, terrified eyes, and he was crouched against the wall with his hands over his mouth, trying not to breathe the poisoned air. His skin had already turned pale, and tears streamed down his face as he coughed and gasped for breath. Kalira stopped and looked at him, and something stirred in her chest that she did not understand. She could walk away, for he was just one human child among billions, and his death would mean nothing to the galaxy at large. But he looked up at her with those frightened eyes, and she saw not a primitive alien, but simply a child who was afraid and alone, and dying before she could think about what she was doing. Kalira crossed the corridor and knelt beside him, and she unwrapped the outer layer of her ceremonial robes with 2 of her hands. While her other 2 lifted the boy to his feet, she pressed the fabric against his face, creating a filter that would block the worst of the toxins, and she spoke to him in his own language, which she had learned during the journey to Earth. Breathe slowly through the cloth and do not remove it, no matter what happens. The boy nodded, his whole body trembling, and Kalira lifted him onto her back with ease, for he weighed almost nothing to her. She began to walk through the corridors, following the emergency lighting toward what she hoped was a safe zone, and the boy clung to her with desperate strength. His small fingers gripped her shoulders, and she could feel his heart racing against her back like a frightened bird. The journey took nearly an hour, for many passages were blocked by sealed doors or filled with even higher concentrations of the toxic gas. and Kalira had to backtrack several times throughout it all. The boy remained silent except for his ragged breathing, trusting her completely, even though she was a stranger and an alien and everything about her must have seemed terrifying. Kala found herself speaking to him as she walked, telling him stories of her homeworld in a soft voice, describing the crystal forests and the singing winds and the great moons that rose each night in colors humans had never seen. She did not know why she did this, only that it seemed to calm him, and his grip on her shoulders slowly relaxed as he listened. When they finally reached a sealed safe room where rescue teams had gathered, the boy was barely conscious, his body limp against her back. Medical personnel rushed forward as Kalira set him down on a stretcher, and she watched as they pressed masks to his face and injected him with medicines, opened his eyes one last time before they carried him away. And he looked at her with an expression she would never forget. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then he was gone, and Kalira's guards arrived to escort her back to the ship. And within hours she had left Earth behind forever. She never learned the boy's name, for in the aftermath of the incident, there were diplomatic matters to handle and reports to file, and one human child seemed unimportant compared to the larger concerns of interstellar relations. As the years passed, Kalira forgot about him entirely, for her life was filled with duties and responsibilities that left no room for memories of a single frightened boy on a primitive planet. She thought of humans as fragile and forgettable, creatures who lived brief lives and accomplished little of lasting importance. She could not have been more wrong, for the boy she saved that day was named Danny Cole, and he would spend the next 20 years becoming the greatest warrior the galaxy had ever known. He would remember her face every single day, and he would carry the memory of her kindness like a flame in his heart. And one day, when the galaxy stood on the edge of destruction, he would repay that kindness 1,000 times over. 15 years after the incident on Earth, the galaxy burned. The Kreth Dominion came from the dark spaces between stars, from regions so remote that no explorer had ever mapped them. And they brought with them a hunger that could not be satisfied. Their ships were not made of metal, but of living flesh, vast biological creatures that consumed everything in their path and grew stronger with each world they devoured. They had destroyed 17 civilizations before anyone in the United Galactic Alliance even knew they existed. And by the time the first warnings reached the core systems, the Kreth had already conquered a dozen Alliance colonies. Princess Kalira stood in the War Council chamber of the Volanthi capital, watching holographic displays that showed the enemy advance. And for the first time in her life, she felt genuine fear. The Volanthi Empire was ancient and powerful, with fleets that had never known defeat. Yet the Kreth swept through their border defenses as if they were nothing. Every weapon the Alliance deployed, the Kreth adapted to within days. Every strategy the generals devised, the Kreth countered with terrifying efficiency. The enemy was connected through a vast psychic network, a hive mind that allowed them to share information instantly across light years. And fighting them was like fighting a single organism with a billion bodies. Kalai's father, the Emperor, grew older and more tired with each passing month, and she watched the light fade from his golden eyes as report after report brought news of fresh disasters. The Alliance Council met in emergency session after the fall of Rithani Sector, where 3 Volanthi colony worlds had been consumed in a single week, and the mood was one of barely contained despair. Admiral Verkith of the Volanthi High Fleet stood before the council and delivered his assessment in a voice heavy with exhaustion. "We cannot win this war through conventional means," he said, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence. "The Kreth adapt faster than we can innovate, and their numbers grow with every victory, while ours diminish with every battle." Representatives from a dozen species argued and debated, but no one could offer a solution, and Kalira felt the weight of hopelessness settling over the chamber. Like a shroud, then a human officer stood up in the back of the room. And the council fell silent. Humanity was the youngest species in the Alliance, admitted barely 30 years ago. And most council members considered them irrelevant to serious military discussions. Their technology was primitive, their numbers were small, and their representatives were usually ignored, but this human did not seem bothered by the dismissive looks turned his way. He was tall for his species, with broad shoulders and dark hair cut short in the military fashion. And his eyes were calm and steady as he addressed the room. "My name is Admiral Daniel Cole of the Earth Defense Force," he said, and his voice carried clearly despite its quiet tone. "I have a proposal." One of the Volante generals laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the chamber. "What could a human possibly offer that we have not already considered?" Admiral Cole did not react to the insult, and his expression remained perfectly composed as he activated a holographic display that showed a section of space near the Koltakli Ridhani system. "The Kreth believe they understand us," he said, "because they have studied our tactics and adapted to our weapons and learned to predict our movements." He touched the display, and new markers appeared, showing the positions of Kreth fleet concentrations, but they have not studied humans, because they do not consider us worth studying. He smiled then, a small and dangerous expression that made Kalira suddenly pay very close attention. "That is a mistake." The council approved his plan with reluctance, for no one else had anything better to offer. And Admiral Cole departed with a fleet of 50 human ships to face a Kreth armada of over 400. Kalira watched him go and wondered if she was witnessing a suicide mission. 3 days later, the reports began to arrive. The Battle of Rithani Prime lasted 18 hours, and when it ended, the Kreth armada had been reduced to scattered debris. Admiral Cole had used tactics that no species had ever attempted, maneuvers so reckless that the Kreth hive mind could not process them quickly enough to respond. He had crashed cargo ships loaded with explosives into the largest biocarriers at faster-than-light speeds, creating explosions that tore holes in the enemy formation, and sent boarding parties of human soldiers in nothing but armored suits, armed with fusion cutters and hand weapons. To attack the Kreth from the inside, he had used asteroids as weapons, redirecting them into enemy positions with precise calculations that required split-second timing. And when the Kreth finally began to adapt to his tactics, he changed everything again, as if his entire strategy had been designed to be disposable. The Alliance had won its first major victory against the Dominion, and the name Daniel Cole became known throughout the galaxy. Kalira studied the battle recordings with fascination, watching this human admiral direct his forces with calm precision while chaos erupted around him. There was something familiar about him, something she could not quite identify, and she found herself thinking about him long after she should have moved on to other matters. She told herself it was merely professional interest, for she was a member of the War Council and needed to understand the forces at her disposal. But deep in her heart, a memory stirred that she could not yet name, and as the months passed and Daniel Cole won victory after victory, that memory grew stronger, waiting for the moment when it would finally surface. In the 2 years that followed the Battle of Rithani Prime, Admiral Daniel Cole became a legend spoken of in hushed and reverent tones across every world in the Alliance's fleet, which the humans called the Vanguard, struck at Kreth positions throughout the war zone, appearing without warning and vanishing before the enemy could mount an effective response. He liberated colony worlds that had been written off as lost, evacuating millions of refugees from species that had never expected to see rescue ships arrive. He destroyed Kreth supply lines and breeding grounds and communication nodes, crippling the enemy's ability to coordinate their vast forces. And with each victory, more ships and soldiers from other species requested transfer to his command. Drawn by his reputation and his impossible record of success, Princess Kalira made in her personal mission to understand this human. Studying every report and recording and intelligence briefing that crossed her desk, she learned that he had joined the Earth Defense Force at the age of 18, the youngest officer in his class, and that he had risen through the ranks with a speed that astonished his superiors. She learned that he trained relentlessly, pushing himself beyond normal human limits, and that he expected the same dedication from everyone who served under him. She learned that his soldiers loved him with a fierce loyalty that bordered on worship. Because he never asked them to take risks, he would not take himself. But what fascinated her most was a pattern she noticed in his campaigns. Again and again, Daniel Cole went out of his way to protect alien civilians, even when doing so put his own forces in danger at the siege of Thymar Station. He had diverted his entire fleet to evacuate Volanti refugees, when the tactically sound decision would have been to pursue a retreating Kreth formation at the liberation of Kolith Prime. He had personally led a ground assault to rescue a group of trapped Volanti children, suffering 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung in the process, when Alliance Command questioned these decisions, pointing out that he was risking human lives to save aliens. His responses were always the same. "The strong protect the weak," he would say, as if this explained everything. "That is what we are fighting for." Kalira read those words in the intelligence reports, and something shifted in her chest, a feeling she could not identify. There was a memory tugging at the edges of her mind, a ghost from long ago that refused to take solid form. She began to request more detailed information about Admiral Cole, telling herself that she needed to understand him for strategic purposes. She learned that he had been born in a place called Fort Collins in the region of Colorado, and that his father had worked as a maintenance worker at a research facility. She learned that his mother had died when he was young, and that he had been raised by his father alone. She learned that something had happened to him when he was 12 years old, some incident during a diplomatic visit that had changed the course of his life. But the details were classified, and she could not access them. The war continued, and the Kreth pushed back against the Alliance with renewed ferocity, adapting to human tactics with frightening speed. But Admiral Cole adapted faster, as if he had anticipated every move the enemy would make before they made it. At the Battle of the Crimson Nebula, he lured a Kreth supercarrier into an asteroid field and collapsed the entire region with precisely placed explosives, destroying an enemy vessel the size of a small moon at the defense of Earth's outer colonies. He used the gravity wells of gas giants to slingshot his ships at impossible velocities, striking the Kreth before they could even register his approach. And at the rescue of Volanti Station 7, he held a defensive position for 72 hours against overwhelming odds, refusing to retreat until every single civilian had been evacuated. The Volanti survivors of that battle told stories of a human who seemed to feel no fear, who stood on the bridge of his burning ship and directed the evacuation with calm precision while fire and debris rained around him. They said he had spoken to them before they boarded the escape shuttles, promising them that they would live, and they had believed him absolutely. "Why does he care so much about us?" one of the survivors had asked in a recorded interview. "We are not his people, and our empire looked down on humans for so long. Yet he risks everything to save us." Kalira watched that interview late one night in her private chambers, and the survivor's question echoed in her mind. Why did this human care so much? What drove him to sacrifice again and again for species that had once dismissed his own kind as primitive and insignificant? She pulled up his service file once more, staring at the holographic image of his face, and the ghost of memory grew stronger. There was something about his eyes, something about the way he looked at the camera with quiet determination. She had seen those eyes before. She was certain of it, but the memory remained just out of reach. Then a new intelligence report arrived on her display. containing updated biographical information gathered from recently accessed Earth databases. She read the words without really seeing them at first. Her mind still lost in thought, and then one detail caught her attention, and the memory that had been hiding for 20 years finally broke free. Daniel Cole had been present at the Colorado Research Facility during the atmospheric containment breach of the Volanthi First Contact Delegation. At been 12 years old, he had been saved by a member of the Volanthi royal family. Kalira stared at the screen, and the room seemed to spin around her as the truth crashed over her like a wave. The boy in the corridor, the fragile child she had carried through poison air, the small human who had looked up at her with such fear and such gratitude. It was him. It had always been him. The Alliance War Council gathered one final time in the great chamber of the Volanthi capital, and every face in the room carried the weight of what was to come. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Kreth had withdrawn their remaining forces to their homeworld, a massive planet shrouded in organic structures that pulsed with the heartbeat of the hive men. They were preparing for a final stand, gathering every bioship and every warrior for a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Admiral Verketh presented the strategic analysis, and his words painted a grim picture. The Lion's fleet outnumbered the Kreth for the first time in the war, but the enemy position was nearly impregnable. The hive mind planet was surrounded by layers of defensive organisms, living shields that could regenerate faster than conventional weapons could destroy them. If we engage in a direct assault, the Admiral concluded, we will win eventually, but our losses will be catastrophic, and the war will continue for another decade at minimum. Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the hum of holographic displays. Then Admiral Daniel Cole rose from his seat, and every eye in the room turned toward him. Kalira watched him from across the chamber, her heart beating rapidly in her chest, and she saw him clearly now in a way she never had before. The thin boy she had saved was gone, replaced by a man hardened by war and sacrifice. But something of that child remained in the set of his jaw and the quiet determination in his eyes. I have a different proposal, he said, and his voice was calm despite what he was about to suggest. He activated a holographic display that showed the Kreth homeworld and the organic structures that covered its surface. The hive mind is controlled from a central nexus deep within the planet, he explained, pointing to a pulsing node at the core of the enemy position. If we can destroy that nexus, the psychic link that connects every Kreth in the galaxy will be severed, and they will fall into chaos. Admiral Verketh shook his head. We know this, he said impatiently, but the nexus is protected by half their fleet, and no force could penetrate those defenses. A large force could not, Cole agreed, but a small one might. He touched the display, and a flight path appeared, threading through the Kreth formations like a needle through fabric. A task force of fast ships, running at maximum speed through the gaps in their coverage, could reach the nexus before the enemy could respond. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. The task force would not survive the return journey, but the payload would be delivered, and the war would end. The chamber erupted in noise as representatives from a dozen species spoke over each other, some protesting and others demanding details, but Kalira heard none of it, for her eyes were fixed on Daniel Cole, and she understood exactly what he was proposing. He was offering to die so that everyone else might live. She wanted to stand up and scream at him, to demand that he find another way. But she was frozen in her seat as the council debated his plan. In the end, there was no other option, and every member of the council knew that Admiral Cole was given command of the task force, and volunteers flooded in from every species in the Alliance, all of them willing to die alongside the human who had saved so many of their worlds. Kalora tried to speak with him after the meeting, but he was surrounded by officers and advisors preparing for the mission, and she could not reach him. She returned to her chambers and stared at the wall for hours, her mind churning with emotions she had never felt before. The boy she had saved was going to sacrifice himself for the galaxy, and there was nothing she could do to stop him when dawn broke over the capital. The task force launched from the orbital shipyards, and Kalira watched from the observation deck as the ship streaked toward the jump. Point Cole's flagship was called the Endurance, a human carrier that had been with him since the beginning of the war, and it led the formation like an arrow aimed at the heart of the enemy. The main Alliance fleet engaged the Kreth defensive line, drawing their attention while Cole's task force slipped through the gaps in there. Coverija Calais could not bear to simply watch, and so she did something that would have consequences for the rest of her life. She commandeered a Volante cruiser, overriding the objections of its captain with her royal authority, and she ordered it to follow the task force at maximum speed. The battle that followed was the most intense in the history of the galaxy, a maelstrom of fire and destruction that lit up the darkness of Space Cole's task force punched through the enemy lines, losing ships with every passing minute as the Kreth realized what was happening and converged on them from all directions. The Endurance took hit after hit, its hull torn open by organic weapons that burned through metal like acid, but it kept flying, kept pushing toward the target. Kalira's cruiser fought through the chaos, her crew performing miracles of navigation as they chased the task force. Through a storm of death, she reached the inner defensive ring just in time to see the Endurance make its final run toward the Hivemind Nexus. The carrier was dying, flames trailing from a dozen breaches in its hull, but it delivered its payload with perfect precision. The explosion that followed was visible from orbit, a flash of light that seemed to pierce the very core of the planet and across the galaxy. In every system where Kreth forces were engaged, the enemy ships suddenly went silent. The hive mind was dead. The war was over. But Kalira barely registered the victory, for her eyes were scanning the debris field around the Nexus, searching desperately for any sign of survivors. Her sensors detected a single escape pod tumbling through the wreckage, its beacon weak but still active. She ordered her ship forward, and 20 minutes later, she stood in the cargo bay. As the pod was brought aboard, the hatch opened, and Daniel Cole lay inside, broken and bleeding, and barely alive. Kalira lifted him in her 4 arms, just as she had lifted him 20 years before, and she carried him to the medical bay. While her crew rushed to prepare emergency treatment, he had survived, against all odds. He had survived, and now, at last, she would have the chance to speak with him. Daniel Cole drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days, his body fighting to heal from wounds that would have killed any normal human. The medical systems on Kalira's ship worked constantly, repairing torn tissue, replacing lost blood, and keeping his fragile human heart beating. Kalira did not leave his side. She sat in a chair beside his bed, watching the monitors that tracked his vital signs, and she thought about the strange path that had brought them both to this moment 20 years ago. She had been a bored princess on a diplomatic mission, and he had been a frightened child who should have died in a corridor filled with poison. She had saved him on a whim, because leaving him to die had felt wrong. And then she had forgotten him entirely, but he had not forgotten her. Every victory he had won, every life he had saved, every impossible battle he had survived, all of it traced back to that single moment when a Volante princess had chosen to carry a human boy to safety. She had planted a seed without knowing it, and that seed had grown into something magnificent. On the 3rd day, his eyes opened as Kalira leaned forward, her heart's racing, and she watched as awareness slowly returned to his face. He blinked several times, adjusting to the light, and then his gaze found her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he smiled, a tired but genuine expression that transformed his scarred features. "I know you," he said, and his voice was rough from disuse. "I have always known you. Kalira felt tears forming in her eyes. A reaction that would have horrified her younger self. But she did not try to hide them. "You remember," she whispered, "the princess who saved my life." Daniel shifted slightly in his bed, wincing as his damaged body protested the movement. "I never stopped remembering," he said. "Not for a single day." He reached out with one bandaged hand, and Kalira took it gently in two of her own. "When you carried me through that corridor, I was so afraid," he continued. "I thought I was going to die. And then you appeared, and you wrapped me in your cloak, and you told me stories about your world while you walked." His grip tightened slightly. "You were this beautiful, powerful, impossible being, and you could have left me there without a second thought. But you chose to save me instead." Kalira shook her head. "It was nothing," she said. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Daniel replied firmly. "They would not have. And we both know it." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his strength. "After that day, I made a promise to myself," he said. "I promised that I would become strong enough to protect others the way you protected me." He looked at her with those calm, steady eyes. "I spent 20 years trying to be worthy of what you did." Kalira felt the tears spilling down her cheeks now, and she did not care. "You foolish human," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You were always worthy." Daniel smiled again. "Maybe," he said, "but I needed to believe I could earn it." They talked for hours after that, sharing stories of the years that had separated them. Daniel told her about his father, who had died when he was 16, and about the teachers and mentors who had helped shape him into a soldier. Told her about the fear he felt before every battle, and how he pushed through it by remembering the princess who had shown him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act. Despite it, Kalira told him about her life in the imperial court, about the politics and intrigues that had consumed her youth, and about the emptiness she had felt before the war gave her a purpose. She told him about watching his campaigns from afar, about the strange fascination that had drawn her to study his every move, about the memory that had tugged at her mind without ever quite surfacing. "I forgot you," she admitted, and shame colored her voice. "For 20 years, I did not even remember your face." Daniel shook his head. "You saved a child you had never met and would never see again, expecting nothing in return," he said. "That is who you are, whether you remember it or not." The door to the medical bay opened, and an aide entered with news that the Alliance Council was requesting Admiral Cole's presence for the formal declaration of victory. Old viewer Daniel looked at Kalira, and something passed between them that needed no words. "Tell them I will address the council when I am recovered," he said to the aide. "Right now, I am where I need to be." The aide departed, and silence settled over the room once more. In the weeks that followed, Daniel healed slowly, and Kalira remained at his side despite the objections of her father and his advisors. The galaxy celebrated the end of the war, and Admiral Daniel Cole was hailed as the greatest hero in the history of the Alliance. Statues were erected in his honor on 100 worlds, and his name became synonymous with courage and sacrifice. But Daniel seemed uninterested in the praise and glory when the Volanthi Emperor summoned him to the Imperial Palace to offer any reward within his power to grant. Daniel requested only one thing: a private dinner with Princess Kalira, he said, and the court murmured in surprise. The Emperor looked at his daughter, who stood beside his throne with an expression of carefully controlled hope, and he nodded his consent. They dined together that night in the crystal gardens of the palace, surrounded by flowers that sang in frequencies humans could not hear. They talked about the future, about what came next for Avad, warrior who had won his war, and a princess who had found something she did not know she was seeking. They talked about the differences between their species and the challenges those differences would create, and they talked about the strange and beautiful truth that had brought them together a single act of kindness. Performed on a whim 20 years ago, had saved the galaxy. It had also started something new. Something that neither of them fully understood, but both of them wanted to explore when the twin moons rose over the garden, casting silver light across the crystal flowers. Daniel took Kalira's hand once more. "I spent so long trying to repay a debt I thought I owed," he said, "but I think I understand now that it was never about repayment." He looked up at her. This alien princess who had changed the course of his life with a moment of simple compassion. It was about becoming someone who could stand beside you as an equal, he finished at Calla felt her heart swell with an emotion she finally recognized. "You achieved that long ago," she said, "but I am glad you are here now." They sat together as the night deepened, and they did not speak of the past anymore. Instead, they spoke of the future, of the life they might build together if they were brave enough to try. Some stories end with victory. This one ended with understanding, and that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all.